Good morning. It is Sunday, February 10th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Let me just briefly explain the format of these sessions and the Product Mentor program in general. The Product Mentor program was started about 5-6 years ago with the goal to pair experienced product people with earlier career product people to help make better product people. Today we're joined by many of the members, both mentors and mentees. So for all those folks that are part of the program this session, give us a little wave, say a quick hello with your hand. And then we're actually going to do introductions by all of the members of the program. Why don't we do that in just 1 minute? Just a reminder, you can post questions to the Q&A section at theproductmentor.com/live. As the questions come in, I will then jump in and pass them to our mentor during the talk. If you do post a question and you're one of the mentors or mentees, I will actually switch the video over to you so you can ask your question directly. If you're not in the program and I see your question come in, I will do my best to get it myself over to the presenter. So let's do some introductions. Let's keep it pretty straightforward and not super long. Just your name, your role, where you physically are in the world, like don't say your living room. That's not as interesting as what part of the world you're in, and your company. That being said, so I'm just going to go relatively randomly from left to right, at least on my screen, and start with Alberto.
Hey, I'm Alberto. I've been doing product for a really long time. I live in New York City. Latest product is a platform that lets you invest in art, just like you can in stock and other alternative assets lately. So something like being able to invest in real estate, but by buying shares instead of entire buildings.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
I'm Andrew Shu. Yeah, I've been a product manager for about 7 years, and I'm currently working at Oscar Health, where I'm helping manage all of our provider and doctor information so that we can kind of serve our members in the most effective way.
Great. Chris B.
Yep, so I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI for Philosophy. I've been a product manager for about 18 years now, and I live in New York.
Great. Okay, Dominic.
Hi there, Dominic. In Brighton, in the UK, work for a company called Dillerstone Systems, based in London. I'm a product manager for a product called File Finder, which is a tool used by the executive search industry.
Great. Over to Foothill.
So that's probably me. Is that me? Yes.
It is you. Yeah.
I'm Sharon Allpress. I'm a mentee in the program. I've been a product manager for about 3 or 4 years, officially, the official title. I work for DCP Midstream. It's an oil and gas company. And my product helps us most efficiently route gas from the well to the plant. So some prediction in there.
George.
Hey, I'm George. I'm a product manager at Facebook, and I am a mentee in the program, and I'm currently in San Francisco, so it's bright and early over here.
Great. Greg.
Seems to be a sticky mute button. Hey everybody, my name is Greg Rokowski. Currently a product manager at a company called CB Insights. I've been a product manager for about 5 years officially, and I currently work in New York City but do live in Long Island.
Gotcha. Okay. Shobit.
Hi, I'm Shobit, a product manager at Google for Crashlytics, which is our crash reporting for mobile applications. I've been a product manager for 6 years, and I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts, where it's cold.
So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk to us again about user research is a surprise. Chris, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Great to have everybody here today. I'll be talking about user research. I've last minute changed the name just in the name of surprise, but user research is about surprise. And I have a link here that will be a link to all the slides if you want them, and it will be at the end of the slide deck as well. So yeah, so let's get started. I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI Philosophy in New York. I've been part of the Product Mentor group for at least since session 4. I skipped one and then I've done 6 through 10 sessions recently. My background includes Microsoft, Waze, Horizon, Kayak, and then I even started my own company. And then if you want to either email me or tweet at me, those are my contact information. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about user research. And if the first topic that I think is important to go through is really why do we do user research? Why is it helpful? Then I want to go through what a sample research cycle will be, where we're planning, executing, and then synthesizing that research. I want to talk about research as part of your greater cycle of product management. And then finally, a little bit about the future of research and where I see it going. So why do we do user research? And we always have to start, because I work for a design consultancy, we have to start with Don Norman because we always have to pray at the altar. But he wrote a book, Design of Everyday Things. He's done an awful lot of work actually around kind of human-computer interfaces, design, user research, things like that. And one of the stories that I found while doing some research into kind of different types of human-computer interface and automation is one around calculators. And so calculators are something that, I guess the first question I have for everybody is, how many times do you hit the clear button whenever you're using a calculator? And I'm guessing that it's multiple times. And I'm guessing that it's probably multiple times on many different types of calculators. And he saw this when he was doing research in the mid-'80s of how people utilize calculators. And the reason why that happens is because we have this ritual that by jamming the clear button a bunch of times, we know we'll get to some type of state where we will make less mistakes. When the reality is the difference between, say, a 4-function calculator or a scientific calculator or an accounts calculator, they handle memory very differently from each other. And so what this really meant for him was the mental models that we're creating about technology. And what's interesting when we talk about user research is that, and this is a direct quote, so we must discard our hopes of finding neat, elegant mental models. So if you ever talk to anybody that has decided to go off and build something for 6 months without ever talking to an end customer, they believe there is some way that that person understands the world. But the reality is, and they usually do this in a way where they think it is very logical and kind of clear, but the reality is that we need to learn to understand the messy, sloppy, incomplete, and indistinct structures that people actually have. And so what this really means is that whatever our mental models are not what our user models are, our users' mental models are. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be going out and talking to them to understand what their models are. And that's maybe the first point I would make about user research is that you may think that you're a user. Everybody says the mantra that we're not the user. But we're not only the user, but we also interpret the world very differently than our users actually do. The second thing is I just got back on Friday from a conference in Seattle called Interaction, which is a design and UX conference. And so I did a very brief talk there about randomness and biases. And the core of the talk is that, when we have teams of people, we try to create diverse teams of understanding so that we break down biases that we may have about the world. And then the second component of that is we actually go off, we talk to our users to understand what are the biases that they have and what are the differences in the way that we make assumptions or interpret the world when it comes to risk. And what this really means to me is that the second point, very briefly, is that by doing user research, we're actually reducing the bias and risk of building the wrong thing, right? So not only we're doing that through making great teams, but also by going off and talking to people. The talk actually goes into that there's more you need to do around how to break down your own biases or assumptions about the world. But I think user research is really the second major step towards getting there. The third thing really comes from Jared Spool, who, again, we're talking about user research, we're talking about design. We have to mention Jared Spool, and I've definitely stolen a lot from him over the last couple of years. But one particular article really goes into the reason why teams that talk to customers do a better job of user experience. And what he's really saying here is that whenever you have people going off and talking to them, they do a much better job of building an experience that's actually valuable. And so that's my third reason for really using user research. And then trying not to be too self-referential here, but the fourth one is really around competitive. And so, I wrote a post here as part of the Product Management Insider, which is done by Alpha. But really the idea that you can try to figure out who your competitors are by going out and looking at the market. But the only way that you really understand who is competitive in your end user's mind is actually by talking to them. And so that's the fourth point, is that to really learn who your competitors are in the mind of your user or mind of your customer, you have to go off and talk to them. So in recap, really, why do we invest in research? One is our models are not our users' models. We need to go out and figure out what they are and understand them. We need to reduce the risk of building the wrong thing. We won't always remove all risk, right? Because even markets change over time, even after you've released and become successful. And three, you'll have a better user experience overall. And four, you'll actually understand how your customers think about your competitors. So now that we've talked a little bit about why we do user research, let's talk about the user research cycle. And it really breaks down to three things. And this is kind of my clunky way of trying to explain two different things about each of these stages. One, what are the main activities? And then two, what are the questions you should be asking yourself during those stages? So the first stage is really where you're in the planning phase. And this is where, generally you don't just go off and just talk to people. And the reason why that is that you're probably going to be asking the wrong things. You're probably, without preparation, you're going to just go off the top of your head. But what you really want to be doing is making sure that you're aligning everything that you're going to be doing during your research with the actual questions and needs you have as a team. And so the activities here are general planning. And so that's kind of like figuring out who's going to help, figuring out the schedule, things like that. You're going to be writing some type of interview guide, which will be, I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. But really trying to get feedback from the team to make sure you're asking the right questions. You're going to do recruitment, which is you're going to go to wherever your customers are and you're going to find them and get them to say yes to be part of this, to participate in the study. And then finally, you're going to schedule them. During this phase, what's really important is you need to be focusing in what is our main question, right? It's very, very rare that you go into some type of research, even for very early stage discovery work, where you do not have a particular question or hypothesis or need. And so I just want to make sure that's clear. Second thing is there's lots of different ways you can do research. And so this is where you're going to be talking about, what is the right type of research for the question that we have? And then finally, who is the right type of person? Who do we think our customer is right now? During the execution phase, you're really doing these interviews or visits or some type of, sending out surveys, things like that. And during this phase, what's most important to try to understand is how do you actually reduce your own bias from the process? So you'll have ways that you think things should be happening. But if you allow that to kind of interject itself into your research, you'll do worse research. And then finally, how do we reduce the bias of our interviewees? So, they have beliefs about their world, which is not actually reality as well. And so how do we structure our interviews so that we get away from that? In the synthesize phase, this is after you're done actually doing the interviews. You're going to then review the interviews again. Usually you should be recording them. You're going to do something called synthesis, which is trying to break this into parts that you can now use with the rest of the team, and then finally distribute this information, usually to stakeholders and usually the rest of your team. And really the questions here is, what did we learn? And maybe getting to the point of this talk is what is surprising to us and our stakeholders, and why. And that's actually the most important information that we're trying to get out of here. So I want to just talk really briefly about what my stack is for research. So when we do research, we're not doing it alone. We're not doing it usually just with our bare hands. There's actually a lot of tools that we utilize. And so the first set is really, I do a lot of my own recruitment when I do research. And so I do that via Craigslist or LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, that could mean things like doing posts to network to other people, but it could also be ads. I use Calendly to do scheduling because I'd much rather give someone a link and they decide when it will actually fit into my schedule. I found Zoom to be pretty great because I can give people phone numbers. I can give them web links. They can do web sharing. I can see, video conferencing of them, but then I can also do recording very easily, and they do a pretty good job of compressing that recording. Finally, I'll use Google Docs and Sheets really for interview scripts and synthesis, and then Sheets for something called Rainbow spreadsheets, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But it's really just a way to do synthesis. Airtable I use for nuggets, which is another part of synthesis, and I'll talk about that. And then finally, Temi is something I've found to be pretty great when it comes to transcription for longer term storage. So that's my stack. Definitely recommend you check out these tools. There are definitely at least a handful of tools in each of these categories that I've tried out that maybe haven't fared as well or haven't worked for me as well. So I'm happy to talk about those too if people want to later. And again, the most important aspect of research is it has to start with a directed question. If it doesn't start with a directed question, you're going to be wasting your time because you're just going to be asking very, very generic things that are not getting towards some real information. I always feel amiss to not mention the Kineton Framework in any talk because I think it's very interesting to talk about when we talk about the idea of problem domains. And so I use Kineton when we think about the type of question we're asking and what is the problem we're trying to get at. And so if you're not familiar with Kineton, it's actually by Dave Snowden, who is not the Dave Snowden you're all thinking of, but Dave Snowden from IBM Research. And he created this where there's actually 5 domains here, where there's obvious, which is really, things that we understand very well, we've done lots of times. There's complicated, where it gets into this idea of experts are really helpful here. It's something, like the difference would be that logging into a web service would be obvious, but maybe setting up something like Salesforce and configuring it would be complicated. Complex is when we get into this domain of how individuals are operating with each other. This is the domain of complex adaptive systems, social networks, things like that. So it's really about like emergent behavior, emergent practice. And finally, chaotic, or not finally chaotic, but the fourth is chaotic, which is where just you have no idea what's going on and you just need to do something. And then the middle domain, which is where that like little red area is actually the disorder domain. And that's probably the most dangerous one to be in when we talk about this framework, because it's one where you don't know what types of constraints or problems you're dealing with. And so what does this have to do with user research? To me, the problem that you're trying to find out more about will slot into one of these 4 major domains. And so I think when we talk about doing research, if it's in the obvious domain, it's something where this idea of best practice is out there. Like people have done it many, many, many different times over and over again. And so the idea of going off and say doing some very open-ended discovery research is not as helpful, right? What you should be doing is you should be going out there and what are the standards? What are people doing on a regular basis? And you should use that as your research. So it's more like going and doing investigation than talking to people. We talk about complicated. This is where we start to get into it's a domain where we do want to go off and we want to interview people, but we mostly want to interview experts, because the people that are going to be regular customers may not have an actual knowledge of the way the world works when it comes to doing something. And so this is subject matter experts, this is stakeholders, these are people that really understand the problem very well. In the complex domain, this is where we start to get into where prototyping is really helpful, right? So you don't necessarily know how the system works inherently. You do know that you need to create things, and this is where the probe, sense, and respond comes in the Kineton framework, but you need to create safe-to-fail probes, which in our case tends to be, some type of prototype that will go off and will now not only observe the way people do things today, but also now have them try to use a prototype that we've actually built. And then finally, chaotic is probably the easiest one to deal with because you just need to do anything at this point. So that means you probably just start building before you actually go off and talk to people. And then, the discovery work that I think is hardest but most interesting and maybe more rare is really in that middle part where we're disordered. So you actually have no idea how the system works. You need to go off and start to talk to people. This is where it tends to be very open-ended discovery work, usually user research, where we're interviewing people or observing them in their place, which is called contextual. And so I'll talk about that in a second. So now, once we've started, this is basically the overview of how we're thinking about user research. When we get into planning user research, we first need to start with the interview guide is something that I tend to think about a lot. And so in these interview guides, I really break it out into 4 major sections. And so one is really the instructions. I'll include goals sometimes as well, but usually it's the instructions that should almost be read verbatim for the participant. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We go into background questions, so who they are, what do they do, how long have they done it, what did they do before that. We then go into how they do things today. And ideally, you have them show you this in some way. But it could be, just describing the process as well. And then more often than not, you will have something that you want to show them that you then want to get feedback on. And so that's when you're testing new things. And so what I wanted to do really briefly is I wanted to walk you through a interview guide that I created for a project kind of middle of last year. I've removed a lot of the information that would identify who it was for. But as you can see here, I have a high level goal. There's some instructions for people about like sending out reminder emails, setting up Zoom, things like that. But you'd be surprised, we always forget things. The interview script really talks about this idea of setting people at ease and really trying to build a rapport with them about the fact that, one, we're getting consent for recording. Two, we want to make sure that they understand that we're not testing them, right? Like that is probably the biggest issue, is that when you're dealing with people that may be concerned about their job, for example, they may not open up as much. And so trying to set them at ease with the fact that there are no right answers is really important. We talk about background. You can see here some pretty basic questions around their profession. I do like to understand the history. In this case, it was about people that were expecting or had expected a child while working. So we wanted to ask some basics around that. We then move into, think back to the last time you took parental leave. And we had a lot of questions here. This one was actually maybe overkill. I would probably start with fewer questions up front. Then we moved into, we would now ask them to open the link that we had sent them. And from there, we have a couple different tasks that we're trying to get them to do. But what we'll do is we'll prompt them by saying, in this case, let's say you opened an app to help plan your pregnancy. Our goal is actually hidden from them, so they don't know what they need to do at this point. And then we have a bunch of questions about, how are they interpreting these screens? And you can see this, that there's a couple different tasks that are associated. After they're done with these tasks, we would then debrief them. So, how did you feel about what we showed you? If you had three wishes, what would you change about any of this? And that 3 wishes is not so much about features, but it's about the problems that they have in the back of their head about this stuff. The ones that I think are also interesting are like, was there anything that we didn't ask you, but we should have, right? That's a question where, you don't always get interesting things out of that, but it just happens to be one of those questions that I find helps get a little bit more information out of people. And then, do you have any questions for me? And what's interesting there is that generally they'll be asking questions about why is the study happening, things like that. And so you can give them a little bit more information at this point. But that's essentially an interview guide that I've used, and I'm happy to make that available to anybody to check it out. So that's your interview guide. Once you have this interview guide, you need to start to think about who you're going to recruit. And just at a very high level, there's a lot that can go into recruitment. I tend to recruit by posting ads and then pointing them to things like Google Forms with very open-ended questions. When you talk about regular end customers, like there was one time we were trying to get to people that worked in warehouses, and we posted to Craigslist. We offered a $50 compensation. When people would fill out the Google form, we would not ask, do you work in a warehouse? Because there are actually people that are professional user research participants. We had one person named Serge that showed up for 2 different things at some point. So we asked very open-ended questions. In that case, I probably got 100 responses, and about 5 were good fits, and up to 10 would have been analogous fits. So you may need to recruit a lot of people to get to the right people. But of course, you can also use recruitment services. And so that's something we've used on and off if we have a short time frame, but it can be more expensive, right? The compensation is something that is interesting because for regular consumers that you don't really have any needs, maybe other than demographic, it can be pretty low. It can be $25 for, say, 30 minutes. It can get up to $300 or more if you need a very specific type of participant that is a professional of some type. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make it worth their while to actually show up and be engaged. And then finally, when we're talking about emailing all of these people what they need to be doing, and maybe, in some cases, for example, we were doing a study around a virtual reality headset. And so we need to make clear to everybody that they need to be able to operate within virtual reality. They need to be able to stand up, and they need to be able to maybe not, if they had gotten sickness from VR previously, we asked them not to participate. So try to be upfront about those. A lot of the time, though, like the requirements are really, we just need you to be on the phone for like 45 minutes, and that's totally fine. So executing user research. In this phase, there's a bunch of different methods that I want to talk about, and I'll go through these right now. So these are the way the sets of I guess research methods that we use an awful lot at Philosophy. So the first one is Sales Safari, and this came from a woman named Amy Hoy, and so she first created this where she wanted to understand what were the problems that a particular community was having in getting something done, basically. And so what this does is the Sales Safari, the terminology comes from the fact that when you invite someone into your office, you are putting them essentially in kind of like a zoo. So you're watching them in a place where they're not usually. And so Sales Safari is more about the idea that you're going to go and observe them in the wild at their watering holes, right? And so in this case, Reddit, things like Stack Overflow, really wherever there's an online community, you don't even have to necessarily interact with people. You just go and look at what the problems are that they're having. And so this is a screenshot of analytics, the analytics subreddit. But like if I wanted to ship something that was really focused on, I'm trying to do a better job of providing analytics services, I would go here and I would see what are all the problems these people are currently having. I would be writing them down. It's a really interesting technique. There's a talk from Lay Web where Amy Hoy really goes into this deeper for about 45 minutes. So I'm happy to provide that. But I think this is a really interesting non-interactive way to go and do research. The next thing is called contextual inquiry. And so contextual inquiry is where we actually go to the site of where a person works and observe them. Generally not really doing a lot, not prompting them a lot, but asking them questions to get clarification, things like that. This was an actual study where we were working with a company that does gas station repair. And so this person was a dispatcher. And so, you can see here in the bottom left, we had like a clipboard and we were writing things actually on note cards as kind of key moments for later. But we were also recording via GoPro so we could review later. But what's really interesting about this is that if I were just talking to this person over the phone, I wouldn't know necessarily that there's all these lists of phone numbers that are behind their desk right there. I wouldn't understand how their desk was set up. You can see that there's another binder over to the right there that is actually a big part of the way that they do their work. So contextual inquiry is one of those things where if you don't know where to start, but you know who your customer is or you know who you want your customer is, contextual inquiry can be really powerful for that. So anyways. The next one is usability and prototype testing. So in this case, we did this via Zoom. We were showing them a Heroku link, and from there we were actually getting some feedback on a particular prototype. This was actually a built prototype in web technology that was meant to mimic basically an app of some type, a mobile app. But it could be InVision. It could be really anything. Like we could even use sketches to do this. But the whole point of usability and prototype testing is that there's something beneficial about putting something in front of someone rather than just asking them about hypotheticals. And so when you put this in front of them, they're going to have a reaction because they are going to think about like, oh, I might have to use this in the future. How would I use this? And so that idea of prototype testing is really, really powerful. And so I think there's even people in the design world that go under the kind of discursive design, or there was a post last year about provocative prototyping or provotyping. And as much as I hate creating new terms, I think this idea of actually creating a prototype that is potentially very horrible to get feedback from people could be very powerful. And so that's kind of usability and prototype testing. I'll go into kind of the synthesis and how that's maybe different for usability versus just general prototype testing. But you're always kind of doing a little bit of usability. You're always doing a little bit of customer interview while you're doing these things because you're trying to understand how people are thinking about this. Like, do they trust this more than before, right? Do they understand what is going on these different pages or screens? Focus groups. So this is something I always want to bring up, and I really think that they're a bad idea. So I have not found a good time to do a focus group. And the reason why is that you basically, just like brainstorming as a group is a bad idea. And the reason why is that everybody starts to prime or push people towards some type of consensus. But the idea of focus groups is that people that are more dominant will take over the entire focus group. And there are definitely customers we have that prefer focus groups, but I just wanted to say here, because I have a platform for it. Do not use focus groups. They're not helpful. You should be talking to people one-on-one as much as possible. The next thing is surveys. And so as you can probably tell, based on the fact I use this very janky clip art, I also think that surveys are bad. And the reason why is that there is possibly some use for surveys when you want to understand some type of quantifiable information, or you want to scale very high your qualitative information. And so I'd say that there are some people that do good surveys, like SenseMaker, which is a Dave Snowden tool, I think does a good job at trying to get at surveys. But the surveys that you're probably going to do through Google Forms or SurveyMonkey are not going to actually get you the information you need. And especially if you're an early stage company, I feel like going off and observing someone or talking directly to them will gain you way more knowledge. And a talk I just always want to reference about this is by Lisa Rechelt. And so at the Mind the Product, she talks a lot about, and she's from Atlassian, which I think is another great company that focuses a lot on kind of their user research. But a big problem about this type of surveying, but also people will do this with the qualitative information that they get, is that they will try to now turn it into quantitative information. And I think surveys do that the most. They allow you to actually aggregate information in such a way that you're going to get this like false certainty around the survey that you probably shouldn't have had, especially in very early stage circumstances. So anyways, I would just say, unless you are a really, really good person at doing surveys and you've done them a lot and you're an expert, you should not do surveys. That's my opinion. Finally, if we're going to talk about good interviews, right? So there's a lot of different ways people can talk to people, but I think these are really good, kind of the rule of hand that I would say you should start with, right? So one, you should be observing people as much as you can in their own environments. So that's always possible. And especially if you're bringing people that are analogous, but they're not going to work in the same environment, then you should bring them into your environment, or you should talk to them on the phone. But again, it's like, I would much rather you have a phone conversation than no conversation at all. Don't ask them leading, biased, or yes/no questions. Those are the worst questions to ask. And you do want to ask them open-ended questions. And in particular, you want to ask what they've done in the past, not what they've done in the future. There's still the issue that maybe past performance is not indicative of future performance. But the reality is that people think very differently about their future than they do of their past. And at least when you're talking about the past, you're going to be talking about things they actually did. And then one rule of hand that I have is that if I feel like I can answer a question on my own, it's probably not a good question in the first place. Because what you're really trying to go for is you're trying to change the way you think about this with your research. And so if you can just answer this question, if there's a statistic out there that is well known, that is good, probably don't need to ask that question again. There's other questions that are probably more valuable for you to go after. So some examples. Gym, using the canonical case of like, do you go to the gym is one that I use a lot. So like, do you go to the gym? How often do you go to the gym? Do you hate going to the gym? Those are all horrible questions. And the reason why is that, one, do you go to the gym is a yes/no question. How often do you go to the gym is really a future question that, people are not going to consciously lie to you, but they probably have some feeling that, hey, I go to the gym like 3 times a week, right? But if you ask them and they're like, oh, well, the last time I went to the gym was 2 weeks ago. So there's something that usually doesn't jibe when it comes to their future ideal self versus what their actual self is. And then, do you hate going to the gym? That's an incredibly biased question, right? Like, you don't want them to now be thinking about all the ways that they hate it. You want them to think differently, kind of like a very open-ended way about that. So instead, what I would say is you should be asking questions like, tell me about the last time you went to the gym. And ask about, what were the circumstances? Why did you go? What happened there? What did you do afterwards? And then the second one, is a really great one too, is rather than asking like, do you like or dislike, is this bad or good? You should be saying like, how do you feel about the last time that you went to the gym? How did you feel before? How did you feel afterwards? Those are really interesting questions. So yeah. And most importantly, when we're doing interviews, you are not there to look smart. Be quiet, shut up. You're not there to convince them of anything. If you are, you're doing a poor job as an interview. Right? You should be asking questions. You should be building rapport if you need to, and that is, laughing at their jokes potentially. I think there's a lot of different people that are out there that will either be very like stone-faced versus very interactive. I tend to be more interactive, but I feel that gets more kind of comfort from the research participant. And so, but the biggest mistake that people make, especially early stage startups or people that are just getting into user research, is that they have an idea and they want to validate that idea. The problem is that you should not be talking to them about that idea. You should be doing everything you can to nudge them to talk about the space that your idea is in, but you should not be talking about your idea. You should just sit there, listen, and shut up. Okay, it's not your job to be smart. So now, once we've done a bunch of these interviews, right, like we've done, in the case of philosophy, we'll do like 3 to 5 per week, maybe 10 in a week if we have 2 people that are doing interviews, but not a lot. We'll do that for about 45 minutes per participant, and we get a bunch of information out of this, right? So now what do we need to do when it comes to synthesis? So one of the things we do is we do something called kind of affinitization or grouping. And so we'll take all of the different kind of individual observations that we thought were interesting or meaningful. We'll sit in a room with a whiteboard and we'll start to group them on different kind of like, this was all about this type of thing. This was all about this type of thing. This was a particular one where we were working with PwC and Google for that field service operations group. And we wanted to look at everything that had to do with the AI part of the system. And we wanted to graph it. In this case, we wanted to get some better understanding about, well, one, did they understand what the machine was doing in that case? And so the vertical axis is not understanding at the bottom to understanding at the top. And then from negative sentiment to positive sentiment from left to right. And what was interesting about this is we saw some interesting groupings, right? So below the horizontal line, it was really, they didn't understand what was going on. So we either need to do a better job of like change management, or we need to just fix the UX because it wasn't doing what they needed it to do. The upper right-hand corner was that the automation in this case, or the AI in this case, the machine learning kind of prototyping was doing what they thought it would do. And it was good, right? So these were, validation of what we called Patrick at the time, which was the bot. And then the upper left-hand corner ended up being, I know what it's doing and I don't like it. And so we first interpreted that as job security. So like, why is this thing taking over? Now, what's interesting is that you can actually look at this in a couple different viewpoints. So those 2 clusters, the one on the right and the one on the left, you could look at, this is the right stuff to automate and this is job security. But you could also look at it from the standpoint of that things in the right-hand cluster is really the bullshit job stuff, right? And that's the stuff that they don't feel like they should be doing. But the stuff in the upper left-hand corner are the things that really make their job meaningful, right? And so once we interpreted that way, it meant that we were thinking about the next step very differently than we would have otherwise. So there's still an incredible amount of interpretation that comes into this. So the question is like, how are we interpreting this correctly? A second way that we will do interpretation, and this is called a rainbow sheet by Tomer Sharon, who was originally at Google, was head of UX for WeWork, and then now is at Goldman Sachs. But he created something called a rainbow sheet. And this is another way to kind of do analysis where you create a spreadsheet where you have a list of tasks that you want, that you believe that this person should be able to complete. And then for each of the participants, you basically mark in, and we had special spreadsheets that were set up that if you typed anything in one of those boxes, it would turn that color. But you could start to see which of these processes actually worked, which of these processes did not work so well. And this is really helpful when we're talking about analysis of usability tests. So, the things that are lower on there, like didn't notice the message bar, is something where it did not test very well. So we should consider that we change the way we're dealing with that particular thing. Next thing that we use when we're doing synthesis is this is Temi, which is, you'll upload. This is the example where we had actually like a VR user test. We ended up having to splice basically the video of the VR that they were seeing, a video from a GoPro of the person themselves, and then also a Zoom because there was like a web prototype that was involved. So it was a very complicated system to pull together all this video. But then we would upload it to Temi, and then Temi would essentially do transcription. And it does a pretty good job. You can pull clips out very easily. I figured out a way to like link directly to particular clips from different things. But I found this to be really helpful. And the reason why is that sometimes it's easier to parse the text than it is to watch the video, and sometimes vice versa. So I found this to be very helpful when we talk about just like how you deal with recordings and how you deal with the transcription of things. I found this to be helpful. Temi is, I think, 10 cents a minute. You can get up into, very, very expensive if you use manual services, but I found Temi to be pretty effective. It doesn't do a good job with like highly specific industry jargon, but that's something you just need to keep in mind. So then what we do usually, once we go from Temi, we have a transcription, we do something that's called Magnetization. And this is, Tomer Sharon is someone that I have a lot of admiration for because he's created a lot of very interesting methodologies. And so one of them is this idea that there's some atomic unit of research that is helpful. And that atomic research should be stored somewhere so that people can use it in the future, right? And so essentially, when we talk about these TEMI transcriptions, it's not necessarily every single sentence here is interesting, right? Or every single sentence here isn't helpful. So what we want to do is we want to pull out some of these nuggets, and that's something that we use Airtable for, right? So we talk about pulling out nuggets. It really is usually a quote. It could be an observation as well. We do this manually today. I want to talk about the future in a little bit, but there's this idea that once we go through the transcripts, we pull out nuggets. And I would say, like, for, say, a 45-minute interview, there could be about 45 nuggets, right? There could even be more if they're talking very fast. And so we then have a link directly into the TEMI so that they can look at the video if people want. But we also start to tag it. And this allows us to now do some interesting things, right? So in this case, the persona for Paula was the expectant worker. So I could go into this system and I could say, all right, we did, in this case, we did 33 hours worth of interviewing over 8 weeks that included 4 personas. But in this case, I just want to understand, when does the expectant worker actually talk about things like 401ks, right? And so I can go in here and I can use basically a search block as part of Airtable to now say, give me all the nuggets that were related to that. And I think that's really powerful. And so this is something that we've used as kind of a handoff to people, clients especially. But I think this is like a good long-term thing as well for companies to start to create. And what Tomer Sharon was starting to do while he's at WeWork was really create a system called Polaris, which is a way to build playlists of these things. So if you wanted to learn about, say you were doing some work around coffee within the WeWorks, for example, you could go and search for all the different coffee nuggets that were there. You could find the ones that were interesting and maybe actually antithesis to what you were believing to do. And you could create a playlist that now you could attach to work that you were doing and say, hey, if you want to know everything about coffee that I think is interesting for WeWork, because we're going to be doing this work, go watch this playlist. And so, this is kind of our jury-rigged version of it because they've never released Polaris externally. But when I did talk to Tomer about it, he said that there were some teams that really got great benefit out of it. They really leverage the ability to create these databases a lot. So I can't say enough good things about doing this type of thing. And one last thing I would just mention is that I've been playing around a little bit with this idea of using off-the-shelf services to do automated nuggetization. And so we're still not there yet. But when we talk about the cost of transcription, when it was like something like those 33 hours worth of interviews, that was like $600 worth of transcriptions costs. When I use my kind of jury-rigged AWS transcribe version of that, it costs about $10. So there's a big difference. It's not a pretty interface, and it's all through this jury-rigged like Jupyter notebook. But something to keep in mind that there are other ways to do transcription that are even lower cost if you need to. And then finally, when we talk about synthesis, you have to do this presentation usually to stakeholders. And so the format that I found to be really helpful is broken down to a couple different sections. So one is really just great quotes, right? Like, what are the quotes that we think are really valuable that came out of this particular study? You'd store all of this in as nuggets in your Airtable or something like that. But like, what are the really interesting quotes that came out from this study? Next, what did we learn that was new, right? So these things are all building on top of each other, right? And I want to talk about that more in depth a little bit later, but basically, what do we know about the personas and the way that they are that we didn't know before? What do we learn about the current process that they use that we didn't know before? And then what do we learn about our prototype, both from a test kind of tactical standpoint, but also from a usability or functionality standpoint. And then it's very hard to break this apart, but I think it's something that's very important, is that we don't want people to conflate what they think we should do with what we observed. And so I tend to break another section out for what do we believe so that people don't put it within that other stuff. And so let me show you really briefly what that looks like. So again, I've scrubbed a lot of the information out of here, but this one was about for basically a scheduling tool for a particular industry around availability and status, and we built a prototype. So, there are a couple of different great quotes that I thought were interesting. In this case, there were booking agents, timelines, and routes. And so what things did we learn about the way they actually think about stuff today? What do we learn about our prototype, right? And then operations for prototype is really like, we had 2 prototypes and they got confused by that, or there was some weird slowness emailing links. We just need, so these are like tactical operational things for doing the test that we should just do next time. And then, this is my version of kind of a rainbow sheet where I'm looking at different goals we had and then who was able to do it. What didn't copy over here is I would actually put comments for some of these where, yes, they did achieve it, but it was on shaky ground, and where they achieved it, where I think we maybe gave away something or something like that. And then finally, this section where we, what were ideas or solutions that we should consider. So that's the overview of this kind of synthesis document. People will also put it in slide decks. I found that like reading a document with people feels pretty good though. So now that you've finished this research, you've provided to people, I want to talk about how does research actually fit into your process overall as a product person. And of course, I always like mentioning John Boyd's OODA loop, which is really build, measure, learn, or agile, or any of these things, all kind of come from this predecessor, which is observe, orient, decide, act, which was a term from John Boyd, who was an Air Force person that then worked with the Marines to help with their doctrine in the 80s. But what's most interesting here is that as part of your process, right, if you talk about build, measure, learn, this idea of observing and orienting is really what research is all about. And observing is you're going off, you're planning, executing, and synthesizing your research. That's observing, right? You're now, when you're trying to now feed this into what you do as a product team, it should still be a slightly separate step, right? So if anything, the orient step is very interesting, because what you're trying to do is now, based on what you've just learned, how do you understand the information that you have? And the reason why that's really important, especially when we talk about this idea of acting, deciding and acting, again, tend to be kind of conflated in the same thing. But what's really important there is this idea that you need to be understanding not only your business needs, not only your customer needs, but also as an organization, what do you believe is the right thing to do? And so anyways, that's something that I think is interesting. And so if we were to get started on this, right, what's really important is that you start small and simple and then iterate and start to build up. And so what that means is that, people feel like they need to create all of this infrastructure right away. I would say that you don't need to do that up front. You should just go out. You should write down, maybe put together an interview guide, maybe recruit some people that are already using your product and talk to them for 30 to 45 minutes. And try to do it as unbiased as possible. I still find myself asking biased questions in the middle of an interview. And so we would start to like jeer at each other if we're on the phone, if I do that actually. But it's something that you learn over time, and it gets easier and easier to do, but it's not something that you're ever going to be perfect at, right? And so, this maybe gets us to another quote from that article by Jared Spool, which is that what is really valuable, and one of the things that he's observed in a lot of teams, is that everybody that is making product decisions really needs to be talking to end customers. And so that means even executives, that if executives are doing things that are making decisions about product, they need to be involved with the process. And the kind of sweet spot that Jared Spool has found for everybody on the team, and this includes engineers, designers, product people, executives, is really 2 hours every 6 weeks. And he's found that if you're able to break that threshold, if you're able to get people to go out and like talk to people and watch these like interviews, things like that, that your products will be way more, the experience will be way better for people, and you'll build better things too. And then finally, when we talk about what is, that line between the observe and orient step and decide and act, is that you should really never take any of your research and jam it into your backlog. This is definitely an anti-pattern I've seen from people. And I think this is one of those things where, I see certain products or services that help product managers that really essentially take user feedback and then just pull it directly over to turn it into some type of ticket that you can work on. And I think this is a big mistake. And the reason why is that you as a product person need to be between your research and your backlog, because you are actually doing the interpretation of what is right or what is wrong. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. It's something that I think is really, really a bad anti-pattern. So for the future, Thomas Rowan wrote this great post about, and I talked to him about this as well, but how would your process decisions be different if user research was just like electricity, right? If you could just plug into the wall and get something like And I think this is something, I don't know if Nis is on right now, but, the idea of alpha and the way that you're asking questions and getting information back is really the beginning of this type of system, right? We want to be able to ask questions. We want to know whether, one, we should go off and collect more information, or whether our current information is out of date, but we should also just be able to get answers from the information that we already collect. And this is a great talk by Claire Gulnick, who is the head of data science at NS1 now. And her talk is all about this idea that evidence is surprise, that for us to actually learn anything, we need to be surprised in some way. And this gets back to that feedback, good feedback needs to be hurtful in some way. We live in this kind of like cocoon of a world that is sometimes an echo chamber, but for us to learn anything, it needs to be surprising. And so this is maybe where I've started to think about the future of how we start to, create research, is that, one, we need to understand the baseline from the client knowledge, right? And then two, we go off and do user interviews to learn new knowledge. And what's interesting to me is that between these three different kind of sets now, you have surprise on the far right-hand side, which is like the most interesting stuff you should be reporting about. You have the middle part, which is known. But then the left-hand side is something I'm still trying to figure out how we utilize correctly. And so that is that we didn't ask the questions to test this information. It could be that there's industry knowledge that is incorrect in some way, or it could be that there's bad assumptions that we have about the end customer. So not only is it about surprise, but it's about what is not jiving with what these people are actually talking about inside their company. And so with that, I will leave you with that thought and just say thank you. But that's where you can find these slides, and I'll send them out to the product group Slack as well. So thank you.
There is actually, I see,
Great.
one question from Andrew, so I'm going to turn it over to him quickly.
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so given, I think as a product manager, we always have a lot of work streams going. Do you have a way that you're automating that rule of thumb to get user research in every 6 weeks, both for yourself and for your team?
Yeah, I think so one of the ways is that I tend to try to avoid dual track development, where you have UX or design off at a separate offset. So part of when we're shipping something, we're actually doing user research about it at the same time. And so, I think that's it can be very hard to get into that path, but that's the way that we found to make sure that we do that. But that means that we're actually doing user research every week or every 2 weeks, right? So we're building something, we're maybe prototyping it from a design perspective in a non-coded way. We're setting up the research, and that's maybe kind of the 1 week while engineering is spiking all of the stuff that they need to figure out to build that particular thing. So they're preparing, they're building baseline stuff. And then the next week, we actually are synthesizing and providing the results to the entire team. The team is then adjusting based on that. So it's more it's like a sprint and a jog, I think is, I can't remember who said that originally, but I think that was actually Thomas Sharon. But a sprint and a jog, 2 week kind of cycle, I found to be helpful. But we have very small teams. We tend to work on very fast projects. I do think that it's valuable that working, if you have a specific team that does user experience, it's just having people cycle through them that they are probably doing research all the time. And so if you have that team, make it a point that everybody has to put in their time, once every 6 weeks, they spend a day with the team, right? This is very similar to the way that people will spend a day once a month as a customer support agent, right? And so I think the same goes for this user experience. You can get a lot around sales ride-alongs, customer support ride-alongs, or working, but I think actually doing this with your user experience team is helpful too.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think we also have a question from Alberto.
Great.
Alberto, can you also go to your video? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, so this is really interesting stuff, but I guess having worked at a variety of startups where time is super limited, nobody's going to have a UX team. What is the best way to try to put this into some level of effort? I've built a lot of different products where we try to figure out if people are going to be interested, and there's not always a mold or a common industry. What are your recommendations on trying to at least conceptually put this into place when the product doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think there's this technique called assumption mapping, or just anything where you're trying to get at your assumptions about the world, right? Trying to identify the riskiest assumptions usually drives us to go off and ask people about those assumptions. And so that's what I would say is when you're very, very early stage, Like if you're doing something like thematic road mapping, you actually don't even have problems on your thematic roadmap at that point, right? Like you don't know what the problems are. But what you do have is you have assumptions, or you have hypotheses, or you even just like, you know, if you're at the very beginning of a project, you're in that like chaotic domain that I was talking about from a Kineton standpoint. And so the truth is that you should just go off, and you should have ideally a question, because you've been pulled together as a team to do something. So now go off and just talk to people. And I would say like starting with 3 to 5 people, scheduling it that small, like of a group, maybe even just saying you'll do it once for now and try to do it like once a month. You do that, I think is a great start, right? It doesn't have to be super in depth. I mean, again, I tend to run a lot of this stuff just by myself as a product person. So while in parallel, I'm doing all of my other product activities like road mapping and managing backlogs and like, you know, fielding questions from design and engineering, I'm the one person doing research where I'm doing scheduling, I'm doing recording of these sessions, right? So the ideal is that you maybe have 3 people involved. You have the person who's interviewing, a note taker, and then an observer. But if you have recordings, I just get into the mode of the interviewer. I don't think about note taking or anything else. I record it. I go back through it later. And so again, start very small. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. It only needs to be 30 to 45 minutes per person. But going after what your assumptions are, your hypotheses are, is the great place to start when you're really early stage, right? Later on, you're now looking at like, how do they deal with this problem in a very real way that you know you want to solve, or is like part of your strategy as a company to solve. Does that help?
That helps. Thanks.
Thank you to today's speaker for a fantastic discussion. As always, this presentation will be posted to our slide share channel. And a big thank you from me to our presenter, and thank you to everyone else who joined us today at the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, like today's speaker, the product people of all sorts, all around the world, visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. If you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free for all job board at theproductjobs.com. And finally, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And see you all next time. Have a good day. Bye.